This is Critical Nonsense, our high-lowbrow show about culture, science, and tech. This week, I ask Joey about correcting people. Guilty.
Woo!
Friday, Friday, Friday. This is what a Joey sounds like. And this is what an executive producer and many hit wonder Jess Vander sounds like.
Hi, this is Jess. I do believe you just did a mashup of Rebecca Black's Friday and Justin Bieber's Baby.
Well, I didn't know I had such talents.
Look at you.
I mean,
Top
you know,
hits.
when you have the gifts, it's important to lean into them.
You've got
I
the
say.
gifts. You've got the gifts.
Side note, Becky has been rewatching Grey's Anatomy again, which she told me at the
Wow.
beginning. I mean,
Putting her on blast.
I don't know how many times. It's like just like a thing that she goes back to occasionally. And before she started this time, she's like, just FYI, I'm going back. I was like, okay, great. Good luck. And she was watching yesterday, and there was a musical episode that they had done at some point that was like, you know, as she said, every show that lasts long enough has to do a musical episode. And I was like, is this show just to demonstrate how many double threat talents they have on the show? Like, was that the goal? Like, where they're just
Pretty
like,
good.
just so you know, we're good.
Yeah, Grey's Anatomy is
That's
good.
all.
It's good. I mean, it's
She-
not,
She
but it is.
she also told me recently, I can't remember, I think she said she cried the hardest she's ever cried in her entire life when Derek died.
Whoa, spoiler alert. Oh, Joey, come on.
I mean, sorry for our
Huge
listeners.
spoiler. Huge
Yeah. But then he came back to life. So,
Okay. Well,
or did he? Jess, what do you got for us?
given our house is clear, I will bring to you a single ponderance that has been knocking at my brain's door. I have been always maybe plagued by this issue, but have been thinking about it in the last week, particularly because of a few different instances where I know that someone has pronounced a word incorrectly. And I have tried to decide whether it is in my interest to correct them or genuinely their interest to correct them. As you know, I have many pet peeves. And it could very plausibly be my own. It's also a question that is so much more than just, is this, you know, is someone's pronunciation of a word, like, that could be, you know, brought about by so many different reasons, like what language they speak as their first language. It could be like where they first heard that language, like where that word, like maybe they were taught it by somebody else a certain way, maybe they read it a certain way, and it's kind of complicated. And yet in this work where precision of language can be extremely important, brand and strategy and articulating what you say and infusing meaning into little words, I don't know, it's kind of important. And so I come to you with this question: when is it okay to correct someone?
First of all, I, as you were talking, came up with the word Vander-ism, which I think is Jess Vander's feelings about vandalism of the English language.
Wow.
which you have strong opinions. So
Strong
maybe we
feelings
have a
about.
recurring segment
because-
called Vander-ism.
Right, sure. Yeah, that's a nice way, like a nice punchy way of just saying, Jess, you're a pedant and you are grappling with that issue.
But this is all you also just did one, which is great. You said pedant, but some people say pedant.
Oh, yeah. Well,
I mean,
part of it. Go ahead.
I'm like I can't actually read the phonetic alphabet, so I don't know how to tell the appropriate pronunciation in looking up the word. So,
well, what's kind of interesting is I think there's for sure an element of this that is tied to a nerddom, and it actually was the subject matter of a comedy show that I went to, where the comedy show was based on nerd debates. And the debate premise was like, is it good for the world that we have like specific words for things? Like on net, should those words exist? And the few examples that they gave were like aglet for the end of a shoelace, or like droop, which is a single one of the orbs on berries, such as blackberries. Like that is of the droop family, and that would be like a drooplet. Tittle, which is the dot over an I or a J. That technically has a name. And the last one is like punt, which is that little at the bottom of a bottle or a glass. And like the premise was like, is this good for the world? And the argument for the nerds was like, yes, it adds specificity. Like there's an origin to this. It maybe is delightful and whimsical. And the opposing argument is like, that's an asshole maneuver. You're being exclusionary, like you're creating excess complexity. Folks for whom English is not their first language, like it's almost a test of whether you can, add even more dumb, nuanced things. And so I grapple with this personally because I'm like, oh no, is this just like part of, my sense of overinflated ego that I'm like, look at these words that I know, but actually is not adding value to other people? Or is there some kind of breaking point wherein actually correcting somebody on a common word or like something that is much more used might genuinely benefit them, and it's not just me being a jerk?
I mean, this is disagreeable giverness, right? Like that's what this is like correcting someone is disagreeable, right? And like that's the sort of inhibitor to, if you are someone who is highly agreeable and isn't prioritizing those things, right, tends to be like people who are non-technical for whatever reason, right? Like nerddom is technical. Right. Like that is a part of it. There is a like, whether you're, in love with like the Marvel verse or, remote control cars or, science fiction or whatever, like it is a demonstration of love to have a bounty of knowledge about something. It's like that Japanese concept of otaku, like more than a hobby, less than an obsession, but like bordering right on the edge. Yeah. And so I think the issue is like when it gets like statusy and gatekeeping, that, right? Like, this happens in like NBA fandom, right? Where the term casual gets used as a pejorative among, and it expanded out, but I think it started in NBA fandom where they're like, oh, you're just a casual. You don't actually like watch basketball, or like, oh, that's a casual opinion. Like actually this person is way better than the other person. We're in like subjective debates, like things that don't actually have like a right or wrong answer, but they're like, oh, you're just a casual. And so those things are like statusy. Like in this instance, in like a one-on-one scenario, like if it is more important to you that the person is right than that like you're not offering them something that you think would be of value, not a good idea. But like if it is a thing that is like important, or you are concerned that they'll be perceived as naive or uninformed or inexpert in some context because of like a thing that is in reality like not significantly important, of like a mispronunciation of a term, but you know, people focus on unimportant things all the time. Like this conversation is like sort of that, right?
Totally. And also, like the things that we collectively have tolerances for, like what is like the importance of whatever is technically correct can shift and also depends on certain subject matter. I mean, I think that's partially why I bring this up, because in the context of our work specifically, it's interesting that even by industry, it can matter how you use language. It's actually, a primary skill, I would say, in this field, to be able to wield it when the time calls for it. And it's then interesting, or at least you can have the sort of objective guise of I'm not just being critical. I am trying to, help you with the skill that will advance you in this field. That said, I have to balance that with my own personal proclivities and be like, oh, I should also check myself to make sure that that is where my motivation comes from.
Well, it's also, like we spoke at some point, I think, about the book that had come out called Like Actually Dude, which was written by a linguist. I can't remember her name. We can look it up. But the nature of the book is just about how language evolves perpetually over time. In those instances, in the title, like actually and dude are covered in the book along with other things, but those words meant entirely different things, and over time the actual definition of the word evolved, not even just the pronunciation, but that as well. And so there is this nature in what you're talking about. There's a conservative instinct and a progressive instinct, not in the political sense, right? But it is like the orientation towards conservation of a thing that you find important.
Yes.
Right. This is why in like otaku based subjects like Marvel Comics, for example, if the writers of the movies do not hold closely enough or honor enough or put Easter eggs into the films for the people who have a conservation type mindset because they love the thing as it was, then they will lose those people. But the other people like don't really care. They're just like, oh, it's a fun movie. Even if they read the comics, like they're like, sure, like make a new story. I don't care. Like I like stories. And so if you in the same way, like if I said something, you like baking as an example, right? Like if I brought up a thing about baking and like said something inaccurate, you're like, baking's important, but you don't care about sports. So if I said like a thing that was like you knew was inaccurate about sports, you're like, whatever, yeah, we're calling it a double touch now.
Right. Basically that it personally may not even matter to me how correct it is, because we're playing loser here. I think that idea of not the political scale of conservatism and what I suppose liberalism, but the sort of progressivism, sure. How that applies here is so spot on, and also underlies sort of like how you're like assessing a certain situation is like, is this my own sort of motivation showing, or in the context of what is like valuable correctness words? It's funny too, because I think that some of that conservatism might look like, oh, I'm trying to make all sorts of things I'm trying to make sure that other people know that I know what is the correct thing. And it's funny because there are also many occasions where it's like, well, I'm actually more concerned that you, other person, will encounter someone else who thinks that way. And whether that is a noble cause or not.
Are you demonstrating altruistic pedantry?
This is the question. I think it actually relates to even emerging parenting styles, wherein to reconcile the cognitive dissonance between like I'm trying to let my kid like do whatever they want, but also like I do want to be able to take them to a restaurant and at that restaurant fit into the social mores of society today so that other people don't judge me. So I need my kid to be capable of doing the dance, even if I don't personally believe that this is fair.
So here's an instance. I learned that auditorily as mores, social mores. And you just said mores. So I don't actually know what the right answer is, but there's one. No, but I think like that permissive, like where do you want to be permissive for intention versus, and like parenting is a really good example. Like what are the important things? Like you let your kids get away with a lot of things, but you set like some threshold where it is or isn't okay. And like restaurant behavior as an example, right? Like my wife, Becky, is like pretty permissive with Emerson around a lot of things, but like restaurants are important to her. And so it is like the least permissive environment that she exists in with our daughter is like restaurants. Is like, no, you behave appropriately in restaurants. It's not even like public spaces. Like that's not even the thing. It's not like she like enforces a thing on the subways or, you know, in a store or whatever. It is like restaurants are special to her. And so there's a way to act in a restaurant.
Yeah, but and it's interesting to balance that with one's own personal values and preferences and like what things matter to you, but also just what an awareness of a certain group or place or community, like what that group cares about, and if you have the preparedness to navigate that at will. I mean, that's the other thing is like, can you just turn it on? If you had to, can you just turn it on and even if you don't really care? I also, besides all of this, which thank you for making my swirl sound smart. You have many more clear thoughts about it than I. I think there are other parts that are really just fun, almost like there is this phenomenon that I now call Ryaning, where Ryan will go over to somebody's home and lean into the host and say, "Did you know that there is a little plastic film on top of your microwave? And you can just peel that off." And they'll be like, "No, what are you talking about? My microwave is just like falling apart. It just looks like that." And I'll be like, "Watch this." And as with a magic trick, we'll like peel off this little plastic corner and reveal that sort of like peeling phenomenon where the buttons are is not in fact a defect of the microwave. It's that there is a protective film that just hasn't been removed that was sort of just wearing away by use of the microwave, and the people will be like, "Oh my goodness, that's amazing."
You restored my microwave.
There's a little bit of that selfishly in this too, of like, get ready to have your mind blown. You had no idea what I'm about to reveal to you.
Yeah, it's also like knowing your audience, like in this sort of narrow set of things you're talking about. Like if you tell me that like I mispronounced something, like we will have like a playful banter, but you would know that I would also value that like exchange, right? Both in like the playfulness of the exchange, but also in the sort of substance of it versus like will other people appreciate those things? Like it certainly is also case by case in understanding, does someone sit within the sort of similar mindset in a particular subject area that you sit in, which is it like, ooh, but also if they're too close to where you sit in that thing, like if one Marvel nerd says to another Marvel nerd, like corrects them on a thing, then it's a status exchange versus like a value exchange. But if you're a little bit further away, then it can be a value exchange. But if you're too far, then it's pedantry.
Now it's just like, oh, let me one up you and show that I actually know slightly more than you do about this. Look at me.
Precision propinquity.
Yeah, precisely. I will say fun things. One fun thing that I learned recently after following the Merriam-Webster social account, which is truly how many comments they have received where someone is like, wow, whoever runs this account should get a raise because they are producing incredible like word content. It's true. But one of the things that they shared recently, which maybe no one else cares about, but I thought was really cool, and I can just enjoy for myself for no status reasoning at all, because I had never known this, but after they said it made a lot of sense, is that many words in the English language can be converted from a noun to a verb depending on where the emphasis is put. So take a word like contrast, the noun, the emphasis is on the first syllable. But if you put the emphasis on the second syllable, contrast, you've now got a verb. And that's the action version, even though it's the exact same word. And I was like, wow, it's so powerful. I can do with this knowledge, just think of all the things that I can imagine, all of the different words I can attempt to use and maybe use incorrectly. And then someone can correct me later. And then we begin this cycle. But didn't that just blow your mind? Didn't I just microwave peel your mind right then?
That's it. I was trying to think about whether, I think we spoke about this at some point, of like the constructs of when we talked about like the order of adjectives, that there is like built-in order that we all agree on is a right way to do it, that none of us know the rule. Do you remember when we spoke about that? And I was like, is this one of those where I know that through practice, but I'm unaware of it, or do I do it wrong? Because I think I would still say, like, no, I would say, I think I would pronounce it differently in that verb contract. Like, I don't know if I would. Oh, man. Anyways, sorry.
Really
I think you put me into. But they're like, to this point, right? You were in a place where you obviously agree that Merriam-Webster knows more about words than you do. So you had an appropriate level of like propinquity to expertise, so that you felt like they could give it to you and it would be a value add. Good versus
value. Right.
Yeah. But there are other places where it's like, you watch, I know you watch like Seth Meyers, like on YouTube or you mentioned it at some point, like his monologues or something, right?
When Trevor Noah was on, I did watch a lot of The Daily Show. Maybe that's what.
Well, Seth Meyers has a segment called Closer Look. It gets a ton of views on YouTube.
Have definitely seen it. Yeah.
People that, yeah. But he then does at the end of the week on Fridays, when he has like the 4 days a week of a show. On Fridays, he does a YouTube only show called Corrections. And it is just the people in the YouTube comments that have been correcting him on things all week. He goes back and addresses them.
Yeah.
But then it turned into like a self-perpetuating thing where they're now called the Jackals. And they're like perpetually looking for things to correct him on that are intentionally, in many cases, pedantic.
Yeah. To make their way in.
it's like feeding the monster of this thing where like-minded people can do it, but then in this instance it became like he likes it, he plays along with them, makes fun of them, but it's like they're his people type of it. Anyways, that's more just an aside of an interesting place where like you can be this type of person broadly, and they're like, oh yes, hello fellow jackal, he said this, but actually the weight of silver would mean that, like I would recommend
terrible.
Watching the corrections, because I think you would appreciate
Because I would
it.
like it. Well, that's
yeah,
that's exactly the thing, is both recognizing the toxic impulse in myself and being able to appreciate, like being able to laugh at it and appreciate that, like, yeah, at times there's value, and at other times it's just very ridiculous, and aren't we so annoying? We, the pedants among us.
Do you think that there's like, I'll just ask this open-ended because I was thinking about, I mentioned before, like people versus thing people. Do you think there's a gender split in this like type of actually behavior?
It's very interesting. I'm certain it matters more about the gender split of whatever the subject matter is, and those that care a lot about it and have the passion so that they want to be the ones to correct you. The one example that comes to mind for my interests is the now infamous New York Times cooking comments sections, wherein people are constantly saying so horrible that it is hilarious corrections to the recipes, sometimes actually rooted in their own ignorance rather than in actually being useful. They'll be like, it said to do this, and everyone else piles on after being like, no, it did not. You just definitely read it wrong.
That was a reading comprehension issue. Yeah.
But and even that I'm trying to think is that like you'd only be able to sort of guess gender based on people's usernames. So I'm not even sure I have a good handle on that, but I certainly I can imagine that there's sort of the throng of people eager to finger wag in any space, and certainly that you can find some gems in that gold mine.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that, like some of that economics research that was saying there's like a 70-30 split, men and women, between people and thing people. Like men are more likely to be thing people, but not exclusively, and then the opposite. So I was just like, are we just saying thing people are the actualies? But it doesn't sound like that's the case. All right, well, do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have done so much to help turn my jumble into a thoughtful and considered way of breaking down when to correct someone, when ideally you're adding value, and the relationship between the two of you and the sort of space and the context around which you're offering a correction is actually the thing, whereas spaces that are more driven by status or a subjective opinion that you're bringing, or your own personal desire to prove to your own self that you knew a thing, that is when you are correcting someone, not to offer a correction, but to foist it upon someone who maybe doesn't deserve that, and maybe it's actually your own fault and you're the problem. And by you, I mean me. So, for all intents and purposes, I'd like to say that we have covered the ground here, and I'm going to cogitate on this for a good while. Words.
I thought it was pronounced Jumble. It's not Jumble? Just kidding. All right. Well, we did it. Critical Nonsense is a Sylvain production. As always, we'd like to thank our executive producer and chief pedant, Jess Vander. We'd like to thank our recording help and sound engineer and suggester, unclear, Alex Contel. We'd like to thank our programming coordinator and man who is always right about grammar, Les Jacobs. We'd like to thank Nora Mestrich and Sarah Gilbert for everything that they do and the fact that they're actually never right. I know, tough news. And as always, thanks, Elen. And special thanks to Miriam and Webster, whoever they are. I don't know a whole lot about them, but, thanks for taking the time for making those dictionaries or merging those dictionaries if you had different ones. Appreciative of your work. Unless, of course, you were not good people, in which case I would say, actually, no thank you, Miriam and Webster. And with that, love you, mean it, bye!
Okay, we're in business.